So those verses that I read came from a collection of teachings from the Buddha called the Dhammapada. And it's really verses that kind of wrapped up discourses that he gave and things like that. Very short, salient sayings. And this is a pretty important book in the Buddhist canon. And in the 6th verse of the very first chapter, which I read, the Buddha says this, and I'll remind you. In this world, hatred is never appeased by hatred. Hatred is only appeased by non-hatred. This is an eternal truth. So being a Buddhist monk, I try to keep this sort of stuff in mind. And as a Dharma teacher, I don't ever want anyone to feel that I might withhold my compassion from them because they don't share my political views or something like that. So when it comes to politics and that sort of thing, I tend to remain quiet, especially in public or around people I don't know. And I get really tired of being quiet. I came to the realization not long ago that it no longer seems appropriate to me to keep quiet. It happened when I was composing my remarks for a candlelight vigil at Stetson. And this happened to be the vigil that followed the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. The Hillel group, the campus Jewish student organization, wanted a vigil. And so I noticed as I was doing this that I had spoken at about one vigil per semester since beginning my career as a university chaplain. A lot of people, including many Buddhists, see Buddhism as a kind of a private practice, one in which we train our minds and develop inner peace. But we all live in a society, and the Buddha taught business leaders and community leaders and kings, so not just monks. And he taught all those people how to live skillfully. And he recognized that inner peace and peace in society are both important and are closely related. So when something happens like the synagogue shooting in Pennsylvania, or the shooting in a country bar in California, or a yoga studio in Tallahassee, or most recently, I guess, at a mall in Alabama, being quiet just doesn't feel right to me anymore. Like most of you, I imagine, I abhor such hateful acts, and I abhor the hateful speech and hateful attitudes that lead to these things. So at Stetson, during that candlelight vigil, someone had snuck out during the night before, the night after the synagogue shooting, and had taped papers to the walkways leading up to the flagpole. So, and the flag had been lowered to half-mast. So the flagpole at Stetson is in front of the student union. And there's a plaza that kind of encircles it, and then there are these sidewalks that radiate out from that center. And so on these sidewalks that led up to the flagpole, someone had taped papers that read, "Is this all we can do?" And on the stones then, right around the flag, were more papers, just crying the thoughts, prayers, and empty gestures that constitute the usual response to these kinds of things. So I don't know who put those papers there, but during the vigil, I told the students that, like them, I wanted to do something more. It doesn't seem enough to just stand there and offer thoughts and prayers and symbolic gestures. But what do we do? There's that verse from the Dhammapada, that damned eternal truth. If you know anything about Buddhism, you know that the Buddha didn't use that word eternal very often. And so he must have thought this was a pretty important idea. And it is. We use the term hate crimes, but listen to what the Buddha said elsewhere in the Dhammapada. He said, there's no fire like passion and no crime like hatred. The Buddha happened to be talking to a young couple when he said this, and they were about to become married. And they wanted to make sure that their lives were in line with their spiritual life. And so he was encouraging them to make their spirituality a priority. No crime like hatred. In other words, nothing prevents you from really living in peace as much as allowing your mind to dwell in hatred and animosity. And so he was telling this couple that if they wanted to live in peace, that they had to keep their passions in perspective. If your life has purpose and meaning, then things like hatred ill will toward others, can inevitably get in the way of your higher purpose. And this is what he was trying to explain to them. The source of hatred is not the actions of another person. It's the workings of one's own mind. So there's another verse that I read earlier. Those who do not brood on such thoughts still their hatred. So to still your hatred, don't nurture it. Don't nurture anger. From a spiritual perspective, and also from a mental health perspective, nurturing anger is unskillful and unhealthy. When you're angry, where is your mind? Anger is generally not something that happened in this moment. It's on something that's in the past or some possible future, but almost never right here, right now. And if you nurture anger long enough, it turns into hatred. So there's a Norwegian teacher, researcher, and founder of the academic field of power and conflict studies, and Johan Galtung, and he was researching the concept of peace building. In other words, how can we create systems that would lead to sustainable peace? And he identified in the process 3 kinds of non-peace, 3 kinds of violence. So we recognize violence very quickly as when we see it as hatred in action. But he said violence takes different forms. So we see it clearly in a physical manifestation as direct violence. Direct violence would be actions that threaten life or diminish the ability of someone to meet their basic needs. The bombing of a church in Alabama in the early 1960s, that's an obvious example. Shooting up a mosque or a synagogue in this century is an obvious example. So we recognize violence when it carries a gun or a bomb or a nightstick. We recognize it when we see someone wrongly imprisoned or dead or denied access to basic freedom and dignity on the basis of color or religion or gender or sexual identity. It can be a little bit less obvious when we see it as structural violence. That includes laws that marginalize a group of people, that relegate someone to second-class status. Something like the Jim Crow laws of the last century, or today's voting laws that make it harder for a targeted group to vote. We may not feel like that rises to the level of violence, to the physical manifestation of hatred. And if we're not personally being targeted, but it's embedded in the system that perpetuates direct violence. I've noticed for a lot of people these days it seems to be easy to shrug off name-calling or generalizing about a group of people. I even see people snicker at the idea of political correctness and congratulate themselves for speaking their minds boldly, saying it like it is. But that's also violence, or can be. It's cultural violence. If we might convince ourselves that we're not participating in violence if it only exists, if it only comes out of our mouths. But if your mind harbors hatred, so will your words. And if your words carry hatred, eventually so will your actions. It's important for us as members of a society to be aware of hatred when it appears around us in any of its forms, to be mindful of its existence and to avoid becoming a part of it. Oppression and violence are the outcomes of hatred, so it's up to us as responsible members of society to oppose those things when we see them. I hear a lot these days about how the problem is that we don't listen to each other. There are people who feel disenfranchised because they don't feel their points of view are heard. And I agree that it's important to engage in dialogue with others and to do it with kindness and civility. But it's also important to say, no, I'm not going to listen to hatred. And to be honest, I've heard a lot of this stuff before. All my life I've heard people blame their problems on the government or the immigrants or college professors or whoever happens to be handy. There's nothing new about this. And sometimes we'll find people who feel like their freedom is somehow under attack because they're expected to treat other people with dignity and accept them as equals. But the freedom to oppress another is not freedom. As long as one person is oppressed, nobody is truly free. If anywhere in the world oppression is considered okay, then none of us is safe from oppression. More than 2,500 years ago, the Buddha referred to three things as poisons. He said there are three things that poison the mind, and hatred was one of them. The other two are greed and delusion. These things are poisonous because they inevitably lead to suffering. They also happen to be highly addictive. If you want to get followers, appeal to their greed, their fear of others, or their cherished delusions. And I think one of the problems that we have today is that there are political leaders and top personalities and entire news networks that are really pandering to people whose passions are inflamed by greed, hatred, and delusion. I think these misguided and irrational ideologies have been encouraged for political and financial gain, and in the process moved into the mainstream. And at some point, to listen to it is to legitimize it. We have freedom of speech, and that's very important. We don't have the freedom to oppress another's speech, and that's also very important. But we're also free to not listen, and I think that's also important. When we give ear to hate speech, we give it credibility. And I think it's our duty to say, no, I won't listen to that. There's no shame in tuning out propaganda, and no shame in walking away from hatred. However, when we decide we want to take a stand against hatred, we need to make a point of first eliminating hatred from our own hearts. So I'll give you the backstory behind one of the times the Buddha said that hatred is never stilled by hatred. Once when his monks were arguing among themselves about something, the Buddha called them together and he told them the story of a prince whose father's land, wealth, and power had been seized by a rival king. And this king also ordered the prince's mother and father to be humiliated and cruelly executed. The prince was away being educated when this was going on, and he came home just in time to see his parents being dragged off to be killed. Over time, over some years, the prince developed a relationship with the kingdom and the king, and eventually he became a trusted advisor. And one day he had a chance for revenge. And as he held his sword to the king's throat, he remembered something that his father had told him right before he died. He said that he should always consider the consequences his actions would have, not just for himself, but far into the future. And he should also bear in mind that violence is never appeased by violence. So the prince had his sword at the king's throat, and he put it away. And he explained to the relieved and surprised king that if he killed him, the king's partisans would no doubt retaliate. And then the prince's partisans would seek revenge, and a long cycle of violence would ensue. And it was better, he felt, to put an end to that war before it started. So, given that, how would we build peace? Like any other practice, we can endeavor to cultivate those things in our mind that lead to peace and abandon those things that lead to violence. So we have to start with an intention to have peace. And I don't mean intention the way we intend to do one thing, but we really do another. I mean the intentions that arises from our core values, our most heartfelt views, and which lead to action. So if we intend to create war, we'll have war. If we intend to create peace, we can get peace. So when I became a Zen monk, I got a lineage chart. And my chart shows this long line of Dharma teachers from Sakyamuni Buddha all the way down to me. And a couple of rungs up the ladder from my name is the name Tetsugen, and that's the Dharma name of Bernie Glassman. Glassman was a believer that Buddhists should engage with the world, and he founded the Zen Peacemakers Order, to which my preceptor, the master who ordained me, belonged. And Glassman explained it this way. He said, the pursuit of enlightenment is for the purpose of the world, not merely for the purpose of the individual. Practices for enlightenment must lead to action in the world. Practices for enlightenment must lead to actions in the world. So to express this as a spiritual concept, Zen Peacemakers was founded on three tenets. Not knowing, in other words, letting go of fixed ideas about yourself, others, and the universe. Bearing witness, seeing all aspects of the joy and sorrows of the world, including your own attachments and judgments. And taking action, doing those things that arise from not knowing and from bearing witness. So in practice, this can include things like doing spiritual retreats at places like Birkenau and Auschwitz, where he took a lot of people to sit and meditate in those places. And today that takes form in things like living on the streets in Washington, D.C. as a spiritual retreat. And in the process, you recognize how the mechanisms of violence that create these situations exist in society today. So if we really value peace, our intentions and our actions will be peaceful ones. We can still speak and act, but in a way that abandons violence and cultivates peace. In other words, in a way that takes into account caring for everyone involved. And if we diligently maintain vigilance over our intentions, keeping foremost our knowledge that violence can't be appeased by violence, then we can cultivate a peaceful heart. But does cultivating a peaceful heart bring peace to a world that is already so consumed by violence? I think it's important to work towards social justice and peace. As a community, as a global community, as a nation, and as a group of folks sitting in church together on Sunday morning, if we want peace, we have to maintain an awareness that peace is good for everyone, and that our actions have consequences that can continue long after we're gone. As long as we harbor hatred in our hearts, we'll never be truly protected from violence and oppression. So yes, there's something more we can do besides thoughts, prayers, and empty gestures. We can conquer hatred. And since hatred can only be conquered by non-hatred, we have to start where it begins, in our own hearts. But we can't stop at that point. So I'm not the only Buddhist thinking about this stuff right now. Bhikkhu Bodhi is a pretty well-known Theravada monk and Buddhist scholar. And he's been working with Buddhists in New York to try to counteract the violence that's growing throughout the world. So he's already pretty familiar with engaged Buddhism. He founded Buddhist Global Relief, which was established about 10 years ago to help alleviate global hunger. And earlier this year, he was called upon again to react to growing violence in the U.S. And so in February, he and more than 150 Buddhists gathered at Union Theological Seminary in New York and formed a coalition dedicated to the struggle for social justice, environmental care, and human unity. And so he said in his remarks at that event, he said, it's not enough to live a life of moral integrity and cultivate thoughts of loving kindness and compassion and the comfort of our meditation halls. It's crucial for us to enter the sphere of action. So I'm not real sure what I'm going to do. But if we're guided by principles of loving kindness and compassion, by a commitment to justice and equity, that it's inevitable that we begin to oppose oppression. And not just oppose, but work toward creating cultures and legal systems that embody kindness, compassion, and justice. So as Buddhists, as Unitarian Universalists, as people committed to living an enlightened spiritual life, we have a lot to bring to the table. We may see ourselves sometimes as on the edge of the mainstream in America, but we bring the values, the contemplative practices, and the wisdom and compassion necessary to nurture peace in our own society and beyond. So thank you for your attention. I'm going to let you have a couple minutes of silence just to let this sink in. So by way of benediction, I'll offer you another quote from Glassman. Zen Master Bernie Glassman passed away earlier this month. He founded Zen Peacemakers in 1996 and was a world-recognized pioneer in American Zen, spiritual leader, author. He wrote a very funny book about Zen with Jeff Bridges called The Dude and the Zen Master. He spent decades teaching Zen and working with socially engaged Buddhism, nurturing the Zen Peacemaker order and developing these retreats in places like Birkenau and Auschwitz. And he passed away in Massachusetts on November 4th from natural causes. So, I'll give you a quote from him. When we bear witness, when we become the situation, homelessness, poverty, illness, violence, death, the right action arises by itself. We don't have to worry about what to do. We don't have to figure out solutions ahead of time. Peacemaking is the function of bearing witness. Once we listen with our entire body and mind, loving action arises. Invoking respectful awareness of our spiritual teachers and with our minds set on peace, we offer our wish today for the happiness and well-being of all. Our paths may at times be difficult, but let us be resolved in this mindfulness. May the infinite light of wisdom and compassion shine within us. So may we recognize each moment as sacred and our oneness with all creation. May we ascend to the throne of liberation together and realize the enlightenment.